Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Chuck Schiele here with Making Music. We're here again today with another artist interview featuring Tracy Silverman, pioneering violinist. He makes his own violins even and teaches at Vanderbilt University and rocks out with the violin like you wouldn't believe. Tracy, how are you?
I'm all right. I'm all right. I teach at Belmont, actually, in
Belmont.
Vanderbilt.
What did
Yeah,
I say?
Vanderbilt. I have taught at Vanderbilt, but generally I'm on adjunct faculty at Belmont. So,
Okay, well, I just read something that said Vanderbilt. That's why I had that down. I'm sorry.
there's a whole
I
lot of
actually,
there's a little bit of misinformation on the interweb, I've heard.
okay.
So,
All right. Well, you've had a pretty amazing career and you're very pioneering, especially with you are not just pushing boundaries of music, you're kind of taking the Coppola route and developing your own instrument so you can push those boundaries, I take it, right?
well, sometimes if you don't see what you want out there, you have to create it yourself, and that has to do with career paths as well. You know.
Yeah, it looks like it's like a Stratocaster version of a violin almost,
It is
which in
very
itself
much
is just
like that.
completely.
Now, yeah, so this is the latest one that I use, trying to get it straight to the camera, that I
Yeah.
use the most right now. This is my go-to instrument. And this was built here in Nashville by a great guitar guy named Joe Glazer, Glazer Instruments, he does a lot of the guitars here in Nashville for a lot of the big stars and stuff like that. He's a great, wonderful guy. And here I'm going to show you another instrument over here. So that one was built as a more or less a replica of this one, which is the one that's a little more stratty looking because of those two kind of cutaways on the top. This one, that's one of the only changes I made between these two instruments. And that's because the cutaway over here, while it looks awesome and does give you a certain sort of unfettered access to those upper positions, which is really nice if you're a violin player,
Sure.
because
Yeah.
we're used to doing this reach around thing. Um, Only problem is, it turns out that upper bout, as we call it, that round part of a violin right there, um, is a real locating device for violin players. This is what we use to feel where we are in this upper position. Without it, it's very disorienting. Um, so that was one of the little things that I discovered about this one. I love the look of it, and this was built by Danny Farrington, who's a great guitar maker out of L.A. And this is the second one that he built for me. The first one I've got in a case here somewhere. It looks quite different from this. It's a very different design altogether. It kind of cuts scoops off that and stuff. But they're all hollow. These are hollow instruments. They look solid because there's no sound holes.
Hmm.
But so this is a work in progress that I've been um, doing for the last you know 40 years. I hate to tell you, it's been a
Not to,
while. I started doing this in 81. I think I built my first
oh, no
fixed
kidding.
string. Yeah,
Not to take the conversation completely there, but does
please.
that thing does it have it's electric? Would you use a piezo in the
Yep,
strings or
yep.
something?
It's a pickup made by a guy named Barbera Transducers in
Hmm.
Staten Island, New York. And it's a really it's he's been doing them for since I started doing this. He had just started making pickups back in the 80s. Um, and Mark Wood and I were kind of doing this together. I don't know if you're familiar with that name, but he's got a company called Wood Violins, and he
Oh, I know
produces.
Mark from he didn't know me, but I know him from the NAM show, and
Yeah,
we talked to Bridget Bibbins the other day. She's in with you probably know her, right?
I
Since you
do
have
know
the
Bridget.
Mark connection. Yeah, I
Well,
know.
Mark has been, a friend of mine since '81. I think we met
Hmm.
right after I graduated from Juilliard. I kind of took this severe left turn to my parents' distress. Um, And as soon as I got out, and within a few weeks, I had answered an ad for a rock band, and I was playing in this progressive metal kind of Genesis-y rock band. You got to remember, this was 1981. Actually, this was 1980 because I graduated Juilliard in '80. And within like 3 weeks, I joined this band that rehearsed in the basement of a bagel store in Co-op City in the Bronx. And we had this. Somehow, one of the guys knew the owner of the bagel store, let us rehearse in his basement. We ate a lot of frozen bagels, and we rehearsed down there for years. Never played a gig, but that was when I first started. I had an acoustic instrument, like a crappy little school instrument that I had that wasn't my good one, that I'd slapped a pickup on, and I had a little Roland Cube 60 amp that I used to ride around with on the subway to play gigs and stuff. And I went out there, and the guitar player had double stack of Marshalls, and the keyboard player had his own PA system for his Prophet
You're a
Fives.
real rock and roller.
They were.
You're talking about these amps with such salivation. You're a rocker. Yeah.
Oh, me? Oh, well, so I spent a lot of years in basements and in rock clubs at 3 a.m. So I have paid a few dues. I had a studio in New York in the 80s, all through the 80s, through the crack 80s. I had a studio right near the Port Authority, downtown Times Square, Manhattan. There was a building down there, and that area is actually the Garment District, the old Garment District, New York in the 30s, West Side. And there was this big old building that had once been a factory, probably a garment factory, sweatshop or something. And some genius bought it and rented out all these tiny little rooms to bands who could rehearse there 24 hours a day. You could make any noise you wanted because it was noisy as hell during the day because it was Midtown Manhattan, and at night it was deserted, except for all the crack heads and crack dealers. So it was and musicians had studios there, and actually the guys from They Might Be Giants recorded their album directly next door to me. I had to actually stop rehearsing sometimes because they were trying to record, and they're like, "Dude, do you mind?" But anyway, so yeah, it's
cool.
I paid some dues in New York City, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. And so, well, I love that story. First of all, before I move on, like, okay, so you went to Juilliard. Parents are proud, and then you got out and just pissed off dad by joining a rock and roll band.
You can pretty much chart my entire career by my parents' approval and disapproval levels.
You can tell what's going on by looking at their eyebrows.
Exactly, because it's kind of interesting. I mean, I had this very fortunate upbringing that I'm happy to acknowledge that. I had parents who could afford to give me violin lessons. I mean, we weren't wealthy. They were both teachers. They were both public school teachers. My dad finally got a job in a university, but college. But they were music lovers. And my dad had a great classical music collection and a great jazz collection. My mom had a great musical theater collection, and my brother, of course, I had an older brother, and he had all the rock and roll. And between all of that, I had a lot of music filtering in.
So your parents were very much a part of your formative years then with that kind of...
Very much, yeah. They were
actually, they helped you embrace it, it sounds like, being musicians themselves.
Which is why it was so difficult for them to watch me veer completely off the path.
Well, by now, do they see it as veering, or do they see it that you've kind of advanced?
They see it as veering. They think I got lucky, but I still veered off the path, and luckily didn't fall to my death. I luckily didn't tumble to my death, but I did definitely leave the path. And what ended up happening was, I just I got to Juilliard, again, I was like fortunate enough to be prepared for Juilliard and had the lessons and the background and upbringing to get into Juilliard. And I credit them largely for that and for cracking the whip and making me practice as a kid, because I did not love to practice. I loved to play the piano. I loved to play anything that I wasn't supposed to be working on. I would love to work on. I was very interested in music, but I wasn't interested in doing my lesson, But anyway, got into Juilliard, did enough to get into Juilliard. But as soon as I was there, I started really questioning my career path. And part of that it was, just the shock of kind of being a big deal in my small town, but then getting to Juilliard and not being such a big deal anymore. I was in the same class as Jimmy Lynn and Bobby McDuffie and Nigel Kennedy, and all those guys were there when I was there, and Nadia. And so it was very, very competitive classical world. And and it isn't that I didn't want to compete. It's that, well, it is that I didn't want to compete. What I should say is that it isn't that I didn't feel that I could win in competing with them, that I was sort of intimidated, although I certainly was. Anybody would be. But I really didn't like the idea of classical music being so competitive. I didn't get that. I mean, I was a very creative musician. I was a composer from the time I was very young. I used to have to draw the lines on paper to write music because I didn't have manuscript paper when I was like 5 and 6 years old. I was really into being, creative. And it turns out that the job description of a classical performer is almost the polar opposite of being creative musically, because what you have to do, it's like the Olympics.
Yeah.
The award goes to whoever makes the least mistakes. So you tend to be very conservative. You do everything exactly the way it was taught to you, the way it's been taught to violinists for the last 100+ years. And that's your job. And your job is to play flawlessly, to play in tune, and then bring your musical, obviously, affinity to it. I don't mean to downplay that. But a whole lot of it, if you're a violin player, it's not an easy instrument to play. It's not like you're just pushing some buttons on a keyboard or something. You got to play this thing in tune, and there's a whole lot to it. So it's very rigorous, and so to play without making mistakes alone is pretty much requires 98% of your attention, and it doesn't leave a whole lot of room for creativity. And I just didn't really like that. It's not what I was into music for. A. B. I found this. I found this in the Juilliard library.
Wow.
And still got the library number on it. I don't recommend anybody who really likes a book do this, but because it was so career changing, and it was a total accident. I happened to discover it after I graduated in a box, like, oh, I guess, too late. But this book was very important in my career because it makes the case that all of the master works of the past, Mozart, Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Tchaikovsky, all of the great classical composers were writing in a popular idiom of their time and place. Mozart was writing in this Viennese style that was very popular in Vienna at that time, and 30 years later it was old-fashioned. Tchaikovsky was writing in this Russian school that was taking the world by storm. It was very popular. Everybody loved it. He was a big hero. He was not like this unknown genius writing music in a future language that people will one day understand. It was popular. They were great craftsmen and were pleasing audiences, and everybody understood what they were doing. Some of them were pushing the envelope a little bit, and might have pissed off some audience members by doing something that wasn't quite expected. But for the most part, they were writing in the popular idiom. So I said, well, as a composer, what am I supposed to do? I've got to write in my idiom, and my idiom is rock and roll. If Tchaikovsky were alive today, he would not be writing a violin concerto. If he was an American person,
that was actually going to be one of my questions, considering what you do. If those guys were around today, what do you think they'd be doing?
Tchaikovsky probably
would be like a metal guy, right? Like playing,
or jazzer, would have been doing jazz, or, he'd probably be like a freestyle and hip hop dude, just killing it. I mean, if you watch the movie, he could like say things backwards and stuff. So, he'd probably be killing it. But in any case, they would be writing. What composers have always done is represented their time, their place in the world as an
Well,
artist. They do what a painter is supposed to do, and what a novelist is supposed to do, and that is represent their world as they see it through their eyes.
well, I
That's what
also think
artists.
that a lot of those guys were commissioned by the state or the church or the same thing too, right? So a lot of times you got the king telling you what is cool and what's not, right? So these days we don't really have, at least in America, we don't have that,
Yeah,
where
maybe we could have
the
used it a
creative
little more.
process does not have the politic on board in the same way.
No, but it does
So
have this
anarchy is
different.
cool. What?
It does have this different dynamic of becoming an industry, which it was not then. It was patron
Right.
supported then. Now it's a commercial industry. So, and this is where classical music and popular music kind of took different courses. And without getting deep into down that rabbit hole, I just want to say, as a
Yeah.
string player, as a string player, what happened is strings really, like at the beginning of the jazz age, that sort of early 20th century, strings represented the old world. They represented Strauss and Europe and elegance and money and whiteness and privilege and all of those things um, that jazz did not have anything to do with. So it really became an outsider in the jazz world, and the jazzers were like, that's the white man's music, kind of, that's not our world. And so strings sort of went, that's not our world. We're this beautiful music of Mozart. And
Mhm.
so they kind of went in separate directions. String pedagogy stayed in this state of arrested development, teaching the same sort of Russian school that was developed at the beginning of the 20th century, and just that's what I learned at Juilliard, and that's what they're teaching today. And it's the foundation of classical music, and it's really important, and that's how you learn how to play that. However, historically, strings have always participated in the popular idiom of their day, and now they don't. Now there's guitars playing rock, there's saxophones and trumpets playing jazz.
Huh. That's an interesting thing. So, so instead of evolving with the times, a few violin players aside, uh, they developed just new instruments altogether to address the parlance of this musical time.
Yeah.
Like now we do have flying V guitars and things like that, and electronic widgets of every kind, and they're still coming out with them.
Well, yeah, I mean, keyboards now dominate. Guitars are now in ancient history. What I came up with in the 70s, 80s, guitar heroes, which is what I wanted to be when I was a kid. That's now completely old school. You got to really search around to find a guitar on the radio these days.
Well, now you also incorporate gadgets into your rig, like you have a pedal board like us guitar players have.
Yep.
You got a looper in there
Yep.
and all that. So you just kind of, I would just love to see you show up to Juilliard with your little gig bag and bag of tricks and stuff, you know.
Yeah.
Hey,
Yeah.
look what I learned, but I don't know, to me that seems like a compelling question. Is like, so I take it it's your personal mission as a teacher to take this new course of showing violin in the terms of where you are in history today, right? So you
I
take a little bit of what you know from Juilliard maybe, and then incorporate the new school of thought. Yeah.
Well, exactly. I consider myself a real activist in this
Yeah.
in this pursuit. In that, what I started developing, like, as soon as to get back to kind of the parent career trajectory thing. After I got out of Juilliard, I started joining these rock bands and have my own bands, and very consciously building these 6-string electric instruments, holding them really low down here with a guitar strap like a guitar player, pretending it was a guitar for the most part, and playing it like while I'm singing, playing rhythm while I'm singing, playing like power chords and backing myself up just as a frontman, and trying and had no guitar in the band intentionally to try to prove to the world that the electric violin could do everything that the guitar could do. And, you know, being on the scene, playing in the rock clubs, doing all that for years, for like 10 years in New York, and getting nowhere, people telling me, why don't you just play guitar, you know? And partly because it didn't quite sound as good as it sounds now. I didn't have the gear together. I didn't have the instruments together. I didn't have the technique together. But what I was doing, I considered this my postgraduate work at my residency at CBGB's, you know, is,
I
I
played
was,
it. I got to
right?
play it twice.
Hilly, Hilly was my buddy.
No
And,
kidding.
but what I was doing over the like 10 years of what I sometimes refer to now as wandering in the desert, searching, finding my voice. What I was doing was developing a very non-classical string technique, because it took me years to forget everything that I learned at Juilliard. And um, and I was, sort of developing this whole technique that I now refer to as post-classical string playing. And it's a different kind of vibrato that sounds like a rock guitar. Here, I'm just going to demonstrate, because talking about music
Sure.
is like dancing about architecture.
Hmm.
Although I actually do like to dance about architecture. But anyway, so like, I think you can hear that okay. I'm going to crank it up a
Yep,
little.
that's good.
So if I spent many years finding the right amp and getting a distortion sound and finding the right strings and the right everything. And those things I'm doing there are called multiphonics. I kind of discovered those. I hate to say it, but I was doing this back in the 80s, and I've been trying to teach people how to do it, and it's kind of weird. So it sounds like a feeding, guitar feedback, and my vibrato is real different. And that's because when I started for 10 years, I was playing it down here on my stomach. And when you're down there, you can't get out of first position. You're holding up the violin with your left hand. You're very limited. So it really changed my technique. I completely, for 10 years, didn't play really any classical music, and just kind of taught myself,
Hmm.
retrained myself how to play it in a way that would sound like a guitar. And the reason I was doing that was because all my friends that I grew up with in high school all loved guitar players. This was the 70s. Everybody had a guitar hero. It was Clapton or, Zappa, Dwayne Allman, Santana, whoever. That was like they're like sports, like quarterbacks or something. Everybody had a guitar hero. Like, well, what rap is now? As rap wasn't around back then. And so I wanted to play music that my friends would recognize, that they would hear, that they would go, "Oh yeah, that's American, that's rock and roll. That's our music. That's our language. It's our contemporary musical language." Mozart is beautiful and is a masterpiece, and I do not in any way, diminish the power and the majesty and the amazing music of the classical, repertoire. But it's not our music. It's 19th century, 18th century European music from a completely different culture, time, place, everything. We need to play strings in a way that's relevant to our 21st century American life of rap and film scores and TV and video games and jazz and rock and all of that stuff and world music, all of that is part of who we are musically as a culture. And there's no reason why strings shouldn't be representing that and involved in that in a genuine, authentic way.
So I have a question on this subject, okay? And it's so I have a friend who played in one of my groups for several years. She's a classically trained union working violin who played with Pavarotti, sat in Page and Plant's little string band when they toured back in the 90s. She's got some pretty good creds. And then she's playing in my group, and we're a rock and roll band. Now this woman, I sang every line that she played on our record and played in our live performances. I would sing, your first note is F sharp, da 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 da, and she'd go, okay,
Write it
she'd write
down.
that down like this. I'd say yes, and we go to the next line and negotiate how that works with a vocal melody or something. This woman had the proficiency where I would say to her, I said, man, I could just dip my hands in some ink, fling them on the paper, close my eyes and draw some lines, give it to you, and and you'd play it.
Yep.
Then there was a show where she came up to me after being in the group for about 2 or 3 years. She said, "Can I take a solo?" I said, "Well, of course you can take a solo. You want to take solo? Just where do you give us the stink eye or the nod, or we'll talk about it at rehearsal where you're going to appear with your solo. Just go for it." And she said, "Oh, I don't know what to do." And she was standing there with her violin on the shoulder like this with her bow up. And we're literally walking off the back of the stage, and it was a fun night. So she kind of missed out on the soloing fun of a cool gig, So she wanted to jump into that, and I said, "Well, just take a solo." And she said, "I don't know how. I need you to write it for me." And I said, "Write it for you?" I said, "Andrea, you know music better than I do. I learned from the street, and I'm learning more formally as I get older and learning from you guys and stuff." And I said, don't you hear your own Yankee Doodle in your head? The key we're in. There's 4 notes that aren't really going to be in there. Can't you just hear the own Yankee Doodle in your head, whatever that melody is?" And she went like this. "No, I don't do that." And it occurred to me the first time in my life that, wow, I've had music in my head playing like a radio every day of my whole life. And so my question is what would you say to her, because she comes from the world that you were trained in. She might have gone to Juilliard too, I'm not sure, but how would you help her get out of that, because she doesn't enjoy being locked in that music of a prior era. She wanted to play rock and roll with us guys.
Yeah. It looks like a whole lot of fun, doesn't it?
And it was good music. Like, we can write changes and we have jazz chops, but we were rock and roll, so we could move around and it just wasn't 1-4-5 all night.
Right.
And a lot of fun stuff.
Yeah. Well, and it's a lot of fun, being in a band and taking a solo and doing all that stuff. It's a lot of fun, and I'm not going to say more fun than classical music. Everybody has a different idea of what fun is, but it's a whole lot of fun. And okay, so first of all, classical players do know how to improvise. It's a muscle that they are completely afraid to use. It's like somebody who can walk but is in a wheelchair all their life or something. It's like
because of the conditioning of formal training.
It's just a muscle they have never used. And this is part of the real tragedy of classical pedagogy. This has to end. There is no reason why anybody with an instrument in their hand can't find a way to express themselves with that instrument. I mean, good Lord. But it is something that needs to be practiced, and just sort of like and should be practiced from the beginning, just the way children learn how to talk. Nobody yelled at you if you didn't speak right, or nobody yelled at you if you fell down when you were trying to walk. Vic Wooten talks about that in his book, right? He talked about that whole idea. Nobody taught you how to walk. You figured it out on your own. You screwed up a million times, then you got it right, and then you kept getting it right, and pretty soon you developed the muscles, and you now know how to walk.
We did a feature in our magazine a couple of years ago about him talking about that.
Yeah. So that's part of it. But and the other thing is that classical musicians, like, if I said play a D major scale, play a D major arpeggio, 3 octaves, they can rip that up. No problem. So if I say, okay, here's a D major chord, play on it, they're like, I don't know what to play. Well, play D major,
Right.
First of all, they know how to do that, but the problem really is like learning a language. So you may know a few words in Spanish, but if I plunk you down in the middle of Madrid, you're not going to be comfortable because you're not used to speaking it, you're not used to listening to it, and you're lost. So this is the real problem with most classical players, is that they have not listened to enough other kinds of music. If you listen to enough jazz, you're going to sing it. You're going to be scatting in your head. You're going to be walking around the bathroom going do da doo doo ba doo doo ba da, you know. And if you listen to enough jazz, you're going to start going, you know, because that's what happens. It infiltrates our brain and it comes out of our mouths, basically. So that's 90% of the problem, is they're not familiar with the music enough for it to just flow. And that has to happen if you want to play. If you want to speak a language, you simply have to immerse yourself in the language. There's just no other way to do it. And so a lot of people want a shortcut, like I spent 30 years learning how to play classical music. I'm not going to spend 30 years learning how to play jazz. Teach me how to solo in 10 minutes. I'm a good player. Right? So, and you know, yeah, you should be able to do that. You have the musculature that you need to be able to do this. What you don't have is the imagination for it, because you don't know what it's supposed to sound like. And you're also not used to playing by ear. So this idea of simply singing something and playing it seems so difficult to classical musicians. And it's so easy. Within 15 minutes, they're killing on it. And it's just like, they think it's so magical to be like George Benson, you know? Like, let me turn the distortion off. You go, now I didn't prepare that. It's this weird cognitive thing that happens where you're thinking of a line and you're able to reproduce it at the same time. And that's, again, a muscle that you develop, but it's not that hard to develop. It's really not that hard to do.
I'm still working on that.
Well, or just sing it like ba ba da da da, and then go ba ba da da da. You know, it's not that hard to play by ear like that. But here's the thing, you know, with classical players, they're like a little bit like typists. You know, you put music up and you reproduce it on the piano, and you're just looking at the music and you're moving your fingers accurately. And somewhat musically, because you sort of know what the traditions are. This is how you play this. But it's very different from writing a novel, right? You know, typing is not the same as writing.
Sure. Right.
And and unfortunately, this is what's happened to classical pedagogy. It didn't used to be that way. Back when Mozart and Beethoven and all those guys, they were all improvisers. And if you were a decent player, you were expected to be able to improvise on your instrument, either to figure out a figured bass line if you were a continuo player out of numbers and make up a line that works, or on a repeat. In the Baroque era, you would change and ornament it differently and add run lines and scales, and fairly involved improvisation that was happening. But Mozart was an improviser, Bach was, Beethoven, they were all able to improvise. Just something that isn't taught, because now what's taught is typing, basically. So again, you know, these are some of the real, you know, deficiencies in classical teaching, I think. You know, but then again, I'm a complete activist in this field. So
well, I think it's cool that we have you. I like people I like it. I think that's what the world needs. I mean, that's what freedom is. You know, you're kind of discussing music that is, you know, like there's a here you are as an artist, as a classical violinist, and you're contained and captured like a firefly into this little jar, and you have to stay there and you can't get out of there. It's like, what the hell's so creative about that? You know, like, I mean, I personally, as a musician, I don't do cover music very much, because Led Zeppelin already did it. Let them have it. I can't do it better. I'll do my own, and that is creativity, you know. So that's always been an interesting thing. And so you're a very refreshing individual, along with people like Bridget and, you know, some of the others.
Oh, there are a lot. Yeah, there are a bunch of us out there. But I just want to just circle back real quick to answer the last question about like how would you get that classical player to improvise a little bit. So there's one other approach. I mean, first of all, yes, you already know D major, and you could play in D major if I asked you to. But here's the thing that I've been teaching for the last 15 years or so, really focusing on in my approach to this post-classical pedagogy. Because yes, you can learn how to get that vibrato and you can learn some stuff, but the real issue for string players is in a complete paradigm shift of the way you approach the instrument from a melodic instrument to a rhythm chordal instrument like a guitar. Strings have never been really approached that way. They've always been a melodic instrument. We have a bow, we have a curved bridge so that we can play one string at a time. And, its real strength, its power in the world of instruments is to be able to recreate vocal-like lines, to have a vibrato like a voice and to bend, to do all that stuff. And in Indian, classical music and Chinese music, Iranian kamancheh, all these stringed instruments all over the world take advantage of this vocal quality. However, especially when you add 6 strings to a violin, in the contemporary world that we are now living in, 5 strings are pretty common now on electric instruments. 6 are getting to be more common, although they've been very rare. But that 6th string gives you this low register so that you can play true bass notes, as true as a guitar's range is. It's not like a bass guitar, but it has that extra octave that you need to sound like you're playing bass and not like a ukulele or a mandolin, right? So you have that extra range. Then the question is, how do you play chords? And this is what I've been focusing on, is this idea of being a rhythm string player and something that I call strum bowing. And that's this whole technique of bass, just as simple as it sounds, strumming with your bow. So and I'll give you an example why this is so weird for string players. And again, I'm circling back, the connection I was going to make is to tell her as an improviser, you can improvise rhythmically as a way to open the door to you to improvisation. And to that end, I've been teaching rhythm playing. And what that means, the strum bowing means, if I told a string player, play this lick, go da 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 da, like a horn line, let's say, right? A string player would play it like this. Or I should go. Right? Let me turn this delay off for a second. Hang on. So a string player would play that like this. With what we call as it comes bowing, right? Because that's what you do. If those are the accents, you play the accents. Now, a guitar player would never play it like that, right? You're a guitar player. You don't play the guitar like this. You don't go, I'm going to play it like this. Right? I'll play just a better chord so I don't hit wrong strings. You don't play it like that. You strum, and you go like this. Which immediately has a groove, as opposed to, right? Which is totally lame. And it's because, so I've discovered this, just like this simple thing is, well, what guitar players are doing is subdividing, is physicalizing this subdivision. What I call the groove on, because it's the smallest particle of the groove.
You're approaching it as a percussive instrument at that point.
Like a chordal instrument, like a rhythm guitar. So it's exactly just like following what rhythm guitar players do, and they subdivide with their hand. So, but the thing is, what they're doing is muting in between. Like, you got this pick noise. So the problem is, nobody's ever really figured out how to, certainly they didn't teach me this at Juilliard, was how to mute notes, how to not play, how to ghost. So if you're a string player, you can do something like, and move your bow and not make noise, but nobody ever taught me that. So you can play this lick like it grooves just like a guitar, rather
Yeah.
than. So you have to know how to ghost, how to mute, how to dampen with your hand, and then there's also this whole vertical aspect of using the bow where you're chopping. And all of this, I call it a 3D strum because I have this horizontal, I have this vertical version here, and you can put it together and do something like this. And just play like a
Badass.
rhythm instrument. Totally paradigm shift for string players. And if you're an improviser, guess what? If you know how to keep time and you barely know what chords you're playing because you don't really haven't learned much theory yet and you're not real confident, but you can go like, and like, whoa, I'm soloing.
Thanks for showing that, Tracy. This is really cool information here, and I certainly, as an anarchist in art and music myself, I appreciate you stepping forward the way you do, and as I'm sure a lot of our readers are. The point being that creativity is the trumping ace in these kinds of decisions. So I appreciate your insight. In fact, we'd love it if you'd come back and do a part 2 because I know that there's much more we can talk about. I didn't even ask you all my questions.
Look
You
how
answered
prepared
plenty
you
of
are.
them. But would you do that with us? Would you come back and visit
I'd
us
be
again?
happy to, man. I would love to. Thank you.
Okay, well then we'll be in touch with you shortly. So
Cool.
to our viewers, once again, Tracy Silverman, professor at Belmont University and pioneer of electric violin stuff and techniques and just attitude with it. So if you're having a good time, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to our YouTube, and follow us on all our social media channels. We're everywhere. And Tracy, do you have a channel that we can find you, website?
I am the biggest kept secret in the world, but I'm really not that hard to find. Tracy
Just Google
Silverman.
his name. He
Yeah.
comes up like he's not that secret. So
TracySilverman.com. My Strum Bowing stuff is on StrumBowing.com.
very good. Well, thank you very much. Well,
Yeah,
I'll
man.
talk to you tomorrow about part 2 of this. Okay.
Sounds good.
Thanks, brother. Have a great day.
See ya. You too.